The year is 1918. The Western Front stretches across France like an infected wound, 400 miles of trenches where millions have already died. In those trenches, a new kind of soldier is about to change the war. But unlike the famous Navajo code talkers of World War II, these men will be deliberately forgotten, their service erased, their sacrifice denied for nearly 70 years. Private Joseph Oklahombi crouched in a muddy trench near the Meuse-Argonne forest, holding a field telephone. He was Choctaw, from Oklahoma, barely 23 years old. He spoke into the phone in his native language, transmitting orders that German intelligence officers listening on tapped lines couldn't understand. 2 companies advancing east toward the machine gun nest. Artillery support in 10 minutes. On the other end, another Choctaw soldier translated back to English for the American commanders. The Germans, who had broken every American code so far, heard only incomprehensible sounds. Within hours, the Americans took positions that had been impossible to capture for weeks. Joseph didn't know it yet, but he and the other native soldiers were making history. They also didn't know that their own government would spend the next 7 decades pretending this history never happened. The story of the WWI Code Talkers is not just about forgotten heroes. It's about deliberate erasure, institutional betrayal, and the specific reasons why America chose to bury this story while celebrating others. In 1917, when America entered the Great War, Native Americans faced a strange contradiction. They weren't even citizens. The Indian Citizenship Act wouldn't pass until 1924, yet they were drafted into military service just like everyone else. "You're not American enough to vote," Joseph Oklahombi later wrote in a letter discovered in 2003, "but you're American enough to die in France." Over 12,000 Native Americans served in WWI, but a small group would serve in a way that changed military communications forever. In October 1918, Captain Lawrence of the 142nd Infantry had a problem. German forces were intercepting every message his unit sent. They had broken American codes within hours of implementation. Men were dying because the enemy knew their every move. Then Captain Lawrence overheard 2 Choctaw soldiers, Solomon Lewis and Mitchell Bob, talking in their native language. An idea struck him. "Can you translate military orders?" he asked them. Accurately and quickly. Within 24 hours, 8 Choctaw soldiers were assigned as telephone operators. They transmitted messages in Choctaw, with other Choctaw soldiers translating on the receiving end. The Germans were baffled. Their best cryptographers couldn't crack it, because it wasn't a code. It was a language they had never encountered. The impact was immediate and dramatic. American forces began winning engagements they had been losing for months. German documents captured after the war showed their complete confusion. "Enemy has deployed new code of unprecedented complexity," wrote one German intelligence officer. "All previous methods of interpretation have failed." But the Choctaw weren't the only ones. As word spread, the military recruited native speakers of other languages, Comanche, Osage, Sioux, and others. By war's end, native code talkers were operating across multiple fronts. Ben Carterby, an Osage soldier, described the experience in testimony given decades later. "They needed us then. We were valuable. Officers who wouldn't talk to an Indian back home were suddenly treating us like we mattered. We thought maybe things would be different after the war. We were wrong." November 11th, 1918. The armistice was signed. American forces began coming home to parades and celebrations. But for the native soldiers, especially the code talkers, the return was different. There were no special ceremonies for them, no public recognition of their unique contribution. In fact, military leadership made a deliberate decision. The Code Talker program would be classified. A memo from Army Intelligence, declassified only in 1986, explained why. Native language transmission represents a tactical advantage that may prove useful in future conflicts. Public disclosure would compromise this capability. All personnel involved are instructed to maintain silence regarding these operations. Despite his decorated service, he had received the Croix de Guerre from France for single-handedly capturing 171 German soldiers. He found that nothing had changed at home. He still couldn't vote. He couldn't own land in his own name in certain counties. He faced the same discrimination he had before the war. "I served my country," he wrote to a newspaper editor in 1921 in a letter that was never published. "I helped win battles. But I come home and I can't even buy a drink in some bars because they don't serve Indians. The same men who thanked me in France won't shake my hand in Oklahoma." Other code talkers had similar experiences. But something worse was happening. Their service was being actively erased from official records. When the Army published its official history of WWI communications in 1923, there was no mention of native language use. When unit histories were written, the code talkers were described simply as specialized telephone operators, with no explanation of what made them specialized. Solomon Louis tried to tell his story to a local historian in 1925. The historian wrote back with a letter Solomon kept until his death. "While I appreciate your service, I find the story you describe rather hard to believe. If native languages had truly been used in such a vital capacity, surely there would be official recognition. Without documentation, I cannot include anecdotal claims in my historical work." This became a pattern. The code talkers would try to share their stories. People wouldn't believe them because there was no official confirmation. But there was no official confirmation because the military had classified the program and deliberately left it out of historical records. Why did the government work so hard to hide this story? Declassified documents and historical research reveal multiple, overlapping reasons, some strategic, others shameful. Reason 1. Future tactical advantage. The military genuinely believed native languages might be useful again. They were right. WAIWE would see the famous Navajo code talkers. But this reasonable strategic concern became an excuse for broader erasure. Reason 2. Racial politics. The 1920s saw intense political debate about native rights and citizenship. Conservative politicians opposed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, arguing that native people hadn't earned citizenship. The existence of thousands of native veterans who had served with distinction complicated this narrative. If native soldiers had been crucial to winning WWI, it became harder to argue they weren't real Americans. A memo from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, found in archives in 1997, stated bluntly, "Public celebration of Indian war service may create expectations of equal treatment that current policy cannot accommodate. Emphasizing the contribution of certain specialized units would be particularly problematic. In simple terms, recognizing that native soldiers had been essential to victory might lead them to expect equal rights. Better to keep it quiet." Reason 3. Academic racism. The 1920s and 1930s were the height of scientific racism in America. Anthropologists and linguists of the era generally believed native languages were primitive and simple. The idea that these primitive languages could be more effective than sophisticated German cryptography contradicted prevailing academic theories. Several linguistics professors actually published papers arguing it would be theoretically impossible for native languages to serve effectively in military communications due to alleged lack of technical vocabulary. When code talkers tried to share their stories, they were often dismissed as exaggerating because academics had proven that what they described couldn't work. Reason 4. The all-American narrative post-WAI America was building a specific story about who had won the war: white, English-speaking soldiers. This narrative served both domestic unity and international image-making. Native soldiers complicated the story. They were evidence of American diversity at a time when the country was trying to project itself as unified and homogeneous. They represented both American strength, their service, and American hypocrisy, their treatment at home. The erasure of the WWI code talkers wasn't just about lost recognition. It had real consequences for the men involved and for history. Joseph Oklahombi died in 1960 in poverty. Despite his croix de guerre and his pivotal role in WWI communications, he received no American medals. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his war service in a single sentence, describing him as a telephone operator. His granddaughter, Mary Looney, later told researchers, "I grew up hearing Grandpa's stories about talking in Choctaw on the phones in France, about how it confused the Germans. But everyone in town thought he was either lying or confused. Even our own family had doubts because there was no proof." He died thinking nobody believed him. Solomon Louis, who had been one of the original 8 Choctaw code talkers, applied for a veteran's pension in 1945. In 1968, Ben Carterby, one of the last surviving Osage code talkers, was interviewed by a young researcher named Sandra Davis. She was skeptical at first. "I thought he might be confusing his service with the famous World War II code talkers," she later admitted. The story seemed too big to have been completely unknown. But Davis started digging. She found references in French military archives. The French had documented the Americans' new communication method using indigenous languages. She found brief mentions in captured German intelligence reports. She found letters home from WWI soldiers describing hearing Indians talking on the field phones. Piece by piece, she assembled proof. In 1977, she published her findings in a small academic journal. The response was swift, from the Defense Department, demanding she classify her research because the information was still sensitive. "They told me I had stumbled onto classified information," Davis told a reporter in 1918. Classified information from 1918. 60 years later, they were still trying to keep it secret. But Davis had published enough. Other researchers began investigating. Native communities began gathering their own documentation. Photos, letters, family stories. The wall of silence started cracking. In 1986, the Defense Department finally declassified the basic facts of the WWI Code Talker program. By then, almost all of the participants were dead. In 1989, the French government, which had better records than the Americans, invited surviving code talkers to a ceremony honoring their service 71 years earlier. Only 3 were still alive to attend. "It's nice to be recognized," said Charles Chibiti, one of the last Comanche code talkers, at the ceremony. "But it would have been nicer 50 years ago, when the men who served with me could have been here." They died thinking nobody remembered what they did. It wasn't until 2008, 90 years after the armistice, that the U.S. Congress formally recognized the WWI Code Talkers with the Code Talkers Recognition Act. By then, every single one of them was dead. The ceremony honored men who were gone. Medals were given to families who had spent lifetimes defending their grandfathers' stories against people who called them liars. "My grandfather told me about talking Choctaw on the phones in France," said Nuchi Nashoba, Joseph Oklahombi's great-granddaughter, at the 2008 ceremony. "For 60 years, people told me he was making it up." Now, decades after his death, the government says, yes, it was true. Where were they when he was alive and needed someone to believe him? As more documents were declassified, the full scope of the erasure became clear. It wasn't passive forgetting. It was active suppression. A 1927 memo from Army Intelligence ordered all unit histories to remove specific references to native language use. Such references compromise operational security and serve no historical purpose. A 1945 letter from the War Department to a researcher specifically denied that native languages had been used in WWI communications, calling it unsubstantiated folklore. A 1963 internal VA memo instructed claims processors to deny enhanced recognition to WWI veterans claiming code talker service because official records do not corroborate these claims, even though the records had been deliberately falsified or suppressed. The government hadn't just forgotten these men, it had systematically erased them, then used that erasure to deny them recognition. The story of the WWI code talkers illuminates a broader pattern in American military history: the selective memory of who serves and who is honored. Black soldiers in WWI face similar erasure. Despite the heroic service of units like the Harlem Hellfighters, their stories were downplayed for decades. It was only after the Civil Rights Movement that their contributions were widely recognized. Japanese-American soldiers in World War II fought in the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, while their families were imprisoned in internment camps. Their story, too, was suppressed for years, with full recognition coming only after decades of advocacy. The pattern repeats. Minority soldiers serve with distinction. Their service is either classified or downplayed. Recognition comes only after most participants are dead, if at all. For the WWI code talkers specifically, several factors made their erasure particularly complete. They were already marginalized. As non-citizens in their own land, they had no political power to demand recognition. Their service was classified. Unlike combat heroics that were publicly witnessed, code talking happened on telephone lines where few saw it. Racial prejudice was mainstream. The 1920s to 1940s were periods of intense discrimination when few white Americans wanted to acknowledge Native contributions. They had no organized advocacy. Unlike other veteran groups, code talkers from different tribes and units never formed a unified organization to fight for recognition. The government actively lied. This wasn't passive forgetting, but active denial, with officials explicitly stating that Native code talking never happened. What can we learn from the 70-year erasure of the WWI code talkers? First, official history is not neutral. It is written by those in power and reflects their interests and biases. When marginalized groups are written out of history, it's often deliberate. Second, institutional memory is selective. The military forgot the WWI code talkers, then had to reinvent the concept in Waterloos. When you bury truths, even you lose access to them. Third, the cost of historical erasure is borne by individuals. Joseph Oklahombi died, thinking nobody believed him. Solomon Lewis fought for decades for recognition that came only after his death. Families spent generations defending their ancestors against accusations of lying. Fourth, justice delayed is justice partially denied. The 2008 recognition was meaningful, but it came too late for any of the men being honored to receive it. Recognition after death is better than no recognition, but it's not the same. Fifth, historical truth is resilient, but requires advocates. Without researchers like Sandra Davis, without families who kept the stories alive, this history might still be buried. Truth needs champions willing to fight institutional denial.